So this next point in the program is called Rapid Transition Scenarios, how the budget is distributed by civil society and academia. So civil society organization Klimatriksdagen, or Swedish Climate Parliament, has published a transition plan for climate neutral society in 2035. The work has been based on a carbon budget that was developed by Isak and Kevin, who will be joining us for this talk later on, and has been supplemented with some additional national calculations on how to better harmonize with the Swedish official emission data. The idea was to pave the way for a just and fair national transition plan that might inspire the government to take a new science-based approach to mitigation policy that is interwoven with both equity and equality. We ask ourselves, is this plan realistic? And could it be broken down into measures? And this is what we are going to discuss later on. But first, you're going to see a quick presentation, a very, very condensed presentation from Torbjörn Vennström, chairman of the board on the Climate Parliament. Welcome. A warm round of applause.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. I feel excited to be here today with you and with Isak and Kevin also. My friend Inger is unfortunately ill today, so she couldn't attend. So I had to do it myself. This is the program Jonas referred to. We have some copies there to buy if somebody wants. You can also download it from our website. And let me see now. I'm running this.
Yes, just on the button there. Yeah.
Yes. Climate Transition Plan for Sweden to 2035. Short how we worked. We have had voluntary groups that have been working for 2 years, and they have based their this plan on citizen proposal that we gathered to the Klimatriksdagen 2014, 2018, and an emergency action plan from 2020, and other various special reports. So the ideas is based on citizen proposal. That's the idea of Klimatriksdagen, to collect citizen ideas about climate action. And we have also tried to build on this carbon budget principles that Isak and Kevin published in 2 rounds, or maybe 3 now. And we have also tried to apply a systemic approach in how to all these sectors in society intervene in each other and policy. And we used a backcasting approach. We tried to think, how shall it be in where shall we be in 2035 in order to respect the Paris agenda and break down from today's situation and try to find strategies. So this is what we tried to distribute the carbon budget into sectors here, as you see. And the cement is the process emissions. And you see that we have sort of, the number is based on the special report 2018 from IPCC, and they were an update from IPCC in 2021, assessment report 6, and they came out with a little more generous carbon budget for the world. And Isak and Kevin has made an update for Sweden that Sweden can have a carbon budget on 355 million ton CO2 in energy-related CO2 emissions to have a chance to keep within 1.7 degree. So But now 22 has gone. The baseline was 22, so now 22 is gone, and we haven't seen any reduction. So maybe this number is what we have today, about 290 million ton still to go. And if you want to try to reach the 1.5 emission, that is much more lower number. So it's a very, very tough task we have here. And our result here wasn't sufficient. We didn't reach our main goal to keep within the 293 million ton. And that is, the number is about 385 million tons from 1st January 22. And that is mainly because of first I want to compare with the Swedish climate goal, 2045. We estimate that that goal inherit a carbon budget about 600 million ton. So that's give us a perspective how far away from the Paris goal Swedish climate agenda is. And we'll see, we still have some work to do to get to real zero. And when we look at sectors, we see this, that we did good work with domestic transport. We almost reached our goal there. But you see the bunker fuels that international aviation and sea transports, they are a big overshoot, and that we don't have a measurement, we don't have the power to change that within this program to reach goals. So we have to find measurements to mitigate that sector. And we were talking before lunch here about a moratorium, because we don't have the technology to bring down aviation other than stop flying. So I think we have to address a lot of behavioral change and also consumption changes in order to get that part down to Paris. The Paris climate goal level. And some energy, the overshoot there is that we still have some plastic combustion in our district heating, for instance. But what we also did in this plan is we tried to make a comprehensive analysis of the carbon cycle in the biomass, Swedish biomass, like forestry, protected areas, land use, bioenergy, combustion, emissions and uptake in waters, and so on. And we used some new research from Lars Tranvik here in Uppsala and Anders Lindroth in Lund that discovered that we have a lot of emission from small waters in Sweden that does not included in this LULCF calculations, where this biogen uptake and emissions are calculated. And we also have new numbers according to clear-cut forests, that there is a lot of emissions in many years from them, from the soil, and that forests, clear-cut forests doesn't become climate neutral within 60 or 100 years. And we don't have that time frame. We know we have to be close to zero in 10, 15 years. So that's why we don't see the bioenergy area as climate neutral. So we made this carbon budget for the nature, carbon law for nature, Sweden. We know there is a project Drawdown, a global project that's trying to make a carbon law for nature globally. And they made a report in September this year, and they said that agriculture and land use today has an estimated loss of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere at about 12.5 gigaton per year. And that has to be bring down to zero by 2030 and to a net sink at about 5 gigaton by 2040. So that's the global level. So this is our lesson, home lesson for homework for Sweden. And there's a lot of, it's a complicated thing to analyze this. And you see there's a lot of factors that are influencing on the carbon cycle in Sweden and also in other countries. But we found that with changing of the forestry system, forest industry to prohibit the cut-clear forestry and to restore peatlands and to use timber for long-life products instead of for bioenergy, that we could create accumulated carbon sink of about 400 megaton of CO2 during this period, that blue shaded area. And that's quite a bit, but that will change a lot in the Swedish forestry system. So there's some hope in this, but we are, and we calculated that the bioenergy would have a small increase up to 2027, and then after 2030 it will be decreasing again. Bioenergy emission cuts from 2030. But we are not satisfied. We know that those gaps in the fossil fuel emission has to be closed. And mainly it's the area of international transportation, industry, and also in energy production. So that's what we are going to work further with in Klimatriksdagen, and we would have to have some help there. I can say, I will add that in the transportation area, to reach the goal, we have to use very tough measures like prohibited to ban fossil fuel combustion engine from 2025 in 3 years in cars. We had to double the public transport system from today. We have to create new system for road fees so that they could sort of bring down traffic with about road traffic with about 30% in order to reach that goal. So it takes a lot to keep in line with the Paris agenda. Finally, this is our plans ahead. We will continue to work with this fossil and biogen carbon budgeting approach. And 3 topics: forestry, and natural carbon sinks, energy and mobility. We will also invite people to envision a resilient and just society within planetary boundaries. And we will invite people to think about how will we do this transition in a way that people feel they are included, it's democratic, and it accepts various forms of situations for people in the countryside and the cities. So we have to have a participative process, and we want to discuss with people how we can create that. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. You can understand. So we're going to invite Kevin and Isak up to have some comments on this, but I would just like to ask one question to you, Torbjörn. How many measures are in this plan, roughly?
About 150, 160 measures.
Different measures
Yeah.
that have all been collected and inspired by the citizens' proposals. Okay.
Yes.
We are going to talk a little bit more about measures, and I will also include the audience on this later on. But firstly, I would like Isak and Kevin to comment. Like, what are your thoughts on this utilization of your paper, or your findings? Is this the way you hoped your paper was going to be used?
I think it's very exciting. I mean, I've read this report earlier when the Climate Parliament had their meeting, and I think it was earlier this year, and was also commenting on it then. So this is a bit of a repetition, but in a new setting. And I think what I said then still holds. I think it's really impressive actually that you've done this, and it's really ambitious. And it's the first time I've seen anything like this being done by researchers or by civil society, at least in Sweden, maybe also more internationally. So in that sense, and based on the sort of work that we've done, so of course it's very fun to see, and it's encouraging, but also the process that I think went into it, and how you worked together, and how you had different groups, and how you really thought things through from different perspective, I think it's very, very interesting. And I think also, so I think that's what I have to say there,
As an academic, I think all we can ever ask is that people use our work carefully, with honesty and integrity. They might do things in different ways to how we may do it, but as long as they are careful and they're honest, that's all we can ask for. And this work, I think, typifies that. It's exactly what we can hope for as academics. We don't have to agree with every line, with every calculation, but I think this looks like really excellent work. So, I mean, to be honest, it's much better than most of the academic work in this realm that I've seen. I think it's fairly clear. If you really wanted to improve your political framework here, then ask this group to be the ministers and the department for looking after climate change, because this is just the sort of thing that we need to be seeing out of our civil servants and out of our governments.
Thank you. We saw how a lot of consideration here went into context-specific details, like harmonizing the categories of national emissions data. How do you perceive the challenge of putting your work and your findings into different local contexts?
I mean, it's a huge challenge. I think what we can say, there are multiple right ways of doing it. There are likely to be multiple right ways of doing that, but there are also probably wrong ways. And this here did look like one of the right ways. But I think they will all depend, if you look country to country, but even within countries, culture to culture, what power do local authorities have? What financial access do they have? So I think in some places where you have a lot of power and financial access, then there's more things that you can do locally and regionally. In other places where government is not devolved to the local area, then obviously it's more difficult for them. So I think it does depend. So that's why I say I think there are multiple right ways of doing this, and this looks to me appropriate for Sweden. But then I don't know the Swedish culture as well as you know it, or as Isak knows it.
I think there's an important challenge in this as well, and I think this is, I mean, since we wrote this paper a few years ago, and since the work we've done after that as well, I've been increasingly, which might have been noticed yesterday in the panel as well, I've been starting to reflect on how carbon budgets are used in various ways. And I think I think that goes for all concepts. So to add what Kevin said before in terms of how research is used, I think that's not only a question, that's not only the responsibility of the of the people using the research. It's also, I think, a responsibility of researchers to constantly reflect upon how the work that we do is changing society or is impacting, especially in these very highly political questions. So I think as much as we're in a hurry to get new ideas out there and so forth, I think for me at least, it's been a process of going through my PhD where you get some time to think about these sort of things, to start to question some of the assumptions that you had from the beginning. So this is kind of an iterative process, and that's why it's important for me with these kind of contexts as well, where you have different people coming from different backgrounds, different perspectives to meet and talk about these things. Because I think there is an issue with this kind of downscaling of a global perspective to the national and specifically down to the local level, where you might end up with very strange, as we talked about before, strange sort of incentives being created. And also that where we miss, going back to the conversation before the break, where we miss what's really important and what the sort of the underpinning reason why we're doing this work at all is obviously not to get the calculations right, but it's about heading in a different direction. So
yesterday we talked a little bit about fairness. We talked a lot about fairness and different models to include fairness in the climate budget or carbon budget. And Torbjörn, you have sort of used the fairness model that you originally described on how to allocate the carbon budget for a country. And then we have had some of our own considerations on national fairness and equity in the Swedish society. Could you tell us a little bit about how you were thinking, how the process has been on equity in Sweden?
That's a big challenge, because you can't just make this, if you make this price like you have a price incentive, then it will hit very hard on people that are also low income groups and countryside groups that are dependent on cars. But you can't sort of, you have to use the price in order to get rid of the fossil fuels, but you have to combine that with sort of creating green jobs, with creating other kind of benefits for people that are vulnerable economically. So we try to think about that, how you use the tax system, for instance. You have to do that in the same time when you do these measurements. So we thought a lot about that, but I think we have still work to do there, and that's why we sort of do this next step with trying to envision this fair society within planetary boundaries and how it should work. And we have to have this participatory processes also. So that's not doing. We are not doing that very well in Sweden today. Those things.
Kevin and Isak, what's your reflection on this next layer of equity that comes when trying to discussing measures and breaking down the national budget?
I'm thinking more about how you implement the budget once it's broken down. I mean, as I say before, I think how you break the budget down to your regions is very culturally specific. So Sweden has to think how it has to do it and what are the powers that its local and regional, what the land and the commune have, what powers do they have. But the overall equity framing is absolutely key, and I don't think we're yet really grasping this. So you're rightly talking about prices. Personally, I prefer regulations to prices. I think prices can be highly inequitable. So I prefer regulations and standards, and actually there's a lot of evidence to suggest that regulations and standards are really good drivers of innovation as well. Almost the opposite to what markets always tell us. Actually, a lot of innovation comes out of regulations. But then I think, the budget you have here is a good chance of 2 degrees centigrade. The budget for a 50-50 chance of 1.5 is half of this. This is already challenging. So the budget for 1.5, half of this. And so I think we then have to think, well, how much further do we need to go, even to do this? And I just did a little search before, so I can't guarantee these numbers are correct, but I did try to double check them. That 60 to 70% of the wealth of Sweden is owned by 10% of the population. Not the income, The income is more even, but the wealth is highly held by a small group. And of the capital income each year, that's basically buying and selling of properties, that side of things, and of shares, 90% of that goes to just 10% of the population. So if we are short of funding for the infrastructure changes that are necessary, there is no shortage of finance and wealth in Sweden. And we know who's got it. We know their names, we know their addresses. And so if we are serious about climate change, we're not short of the funds, and we know where the funds are. And that's a real equity issue. It's have we got the courage in politics to actually open up that debate and start to say, well, how do we access those funds so we can use those for public transport, for improving the quality of houses, for making the big radical changes that this report talks about. So I think there's where the equity parts are.
Just a short comment. We have in this plan, there's mostly, I think, regulations and standards used as a measurement. But of course, there are some price incentives too, and that could be, and that's why we're talking about this, how do you create fairness with taxes or other things. Like this road fee, it would be sort of distributed in a fair way, not just like everybody paying the same fee. But you can use modern technology to sort of guide who shall pay more there.
Another thing that has come up a little bit in conflict with what was said yesterday was this use of a green carbon in the budget or biogen carbon in the model. The Climate Parliament has included some sort of biogen carbon budget in the model. Isn't this absolutely crucial if we want to avoid the smart accounting that we have biogen carbon also in the budget?
I don't think you should ever have any substitution. And I think I would go as strong as to say ever. I think ever have substitution between biogenic carbon and fossil fuel carbon for lots of reasons. For one thing, it's highly uncertain. The biogenic carbon, the fossil fuel carbon is highly certain. And so this is the biogenic side of these activities is not my strong point. It's not my real area. But I would, and I was talking about this, we were talking about this with Emma earlier, that to me, I think we should be focusing on the biogenic side, not on carbon directly, but on ecology, biodiversity. That's that aspect of society, of our ecosystems, and that I think we will get indirect carbon benefits from doing that. But I'd rather our drive be that broad ecological sets of concerns, rather than our drive be carbon, and let's hope if we get some ecological things as well. So I would turn that round. So my preference would be not to include that in our assessments, in part because the numbers are highly uncertain, because we don't really understand the biogenic activities, particularly soils. So we just don't have that academic base to it yet. So I say I would keep those separate.
We gave it a try, but
sort of humble in this, and we keep those. We are not combining them. We have them both, but side by side. And of course, we see the risk that could be used as sort of we have this. We don't need to cut down the fossil, because I agree that the fossil fuel mitigation is crucial.
No, I think maybe a slightly contrasting perspective. I think it's really good that you included it in this, and especially since you kept it separate. And I think, I mean, the perspectives that Kevin raises here around the ecological issues, I of course completely agree with, and probably would go further than Kevin in most ways concerning that. But I think there's something with the carbon budget concept, and also obviously focusing on reducing focusing on sort of fossil fuel-based emissions and so forth. And I mean, I agree with the sort of reasons that you lay out, but there is this kind of, I think there's underlying assumption, also using the logic or the sort of the reference to a carbon budget, that it might act as a sort of Trojan horse, Trojan's Kest, that we suddenly can sort of bring challenge sort of the privileged tools of analysis in our society, which is quantification and an economic logic or an economic thinking with its own sort of so and then bring that into rooms where those sort of conversations aren't usually had. But there is a risk in that process, I think, and that also goes for expanding that logic to include ecological sort of considerations as well, or biogenic emissions. But I think it's also an issue with the carbon budget as it has been sort of conceptualized by us as well, is that I think there's a feminist thinker, author and activist called Audre Lorde, and she has written about this a lot, and sort of she argues that you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. So that's the kind of the contrary perspective to the carbon budget being a Trojan horse that opens up for a different kind of conversation where we're heading, and that's saying that we actually might be undermining the things that we're actually trying to fulfill by using this kind of a logic. And I think we have some disagreement and some maybe similar sort of thoughts on this as well.
Yeah. Just on that, I don't think economics and the quantitative framework is one that the powers use. They're only not through thinking they are valid. They are only interested in their own power, and they will use any tool at their disposal or misuse any tool at their disposal, at our disposal, to maintain the existing power structures. So I don't think there is a belief in competition or markets or any of that at all. I think the neoliberal model is principally about power, and anything will be used, even monopoly powers will be used to maintain that power structure. So I think that in a sense, carbon budgets could be misused by them, but any tool will be misused by them, because all they're interested in is not the logic that comes out of the tool, but in the existing power structures. And that, I think, is what we have to break down.
What would you say is the main reason why we're not talking about consumption emissions in this budget?
This report is talking about measurements regarding the consumption, but when you use this carbon budget method, maybe Kevin can explain better why you can't use a consumption perspective on that.
There are a lot of reasons. Our focus is on carbon dioxide and principally from energy. And you're right there, consumption emissions are important. I haven't checked the numbers in the last few days for Sweden, but very approximately, I think it's about 5 tons per person for our, what we call our territorial emissions. And our consumption emissions, I think, are nearer 8. I think that's right. For carbon dioxide, I'm getting some nods from people who know the numbers. There's a really good website, Global Carbon Atlas, and you can look at that for every country. It gives you consumption and it gives you territorial emissions for carbon dioxide from energy. And so we focused on the territorial emissions, and there are a number of reasons for this. One, it's directly in our control. So we have some direct control over that. If my laptop comes from China, I can't directly control what power source is used to smelt the aluminium to make the laptop. But we can control perhaps whether we import it or not, but that's controlled to some extent by WTO rules. So we have more control over our territorial emissions. The other thing is that there's a high degree of uncertainty over consumption-based emissions. Most of it is based on what's called input-output analysis to do with the price of goods, and that can give you very large errors. So I know that some of the consumption-based accounting in Norway, in Cicero, the numbers they give as outputs are 25% different to those that are developed in Leeds. Both are using input-output analysis. So there are much greater uncertainties. That's not to say we shouldn't think about consumption. It's hugely important. But the levers are different that we can pull to change it, and the levels of certainty are different as well. But we shouldn't ignore it.
Thank you for that answer. I would like to pick up on some of the measures that have been discussed here. We have a moratorium on flying, a moratorium on meat. We have also a hybrid project with the green steel. Amongst these, like keep the forests, no fossil emissions from the transport sector, do you see any of these measures that might be the most potential? How you been thinking about this? I'm trying to, but no, I can't. can't seem to, no, can't seem to. Ja, men då hamnar jag bara här.
Ja.
Ja, det blev väldigt litet. Kan jag titta på den så här? Får ni verkligen... Ja, titta. Det här är en av flera slides då.
Yeah, I mean, I can just say something. And one thought or comment is going back to Mikael Malmeo's presentation this morning also, and sort of where he juxtaposed right in the beginning efficiency versus sufficiency. And I think, I mean, efficiency can go some ways, of course, but you also have what economists call Jevons paradox, which I think some of you are nodding, this idea that increased efficiency doesn't always lead to decreased total consumption or total use of something. It actually can increase it sometimes. So the more efficient something is, the more you use it. So I think in addition to efficiency, I think sufficiency is actually key, whatever area this is. And I think another thing that I wrote, which which was, I can admit here, was about time, which we've also talked about here, and the fact that the climate transition is also often sort of portrayed as being about accelerating and sort of being that we're really in a hurry, and it's coming out of the carbon budget that we need to do things now. And that's very true, but I think a lot of the things that we need to do, from my perspective, is actually slowing things down. For example, transport. So if you slow the ships down that transport our goods, you can decrease emissions overnight, basically very rapidly. That's just one example. There's many other examples. So I think slowing down practices and our economy is a huge challenge also, of course, because it's built on expectations and different vested interests. But I think that is a key leverage point that is probably indirect, but it has very big consequences, I think. I'm not sure. We can see what else is here. Yeah.
One thing that's interesting from these results is I asked, like, what specific measure has the biggest potential, and they're pretty much all different. So there's no common view on what is like the most needed measure here. Traveling has and transportation is coming up frequently. What is your view on that?
We have different suggestions here. It's mainly how it must be. We can't solve this with a few single reforms, or we do have to make all of this at the same time, more or less. And I was thinking this, Michael, it was good with Mikael's presentation there, talking about this, what we have to do in short time to sort of buy some time in order to our investment to play out. And I think we have to do like you talk. We have to put down the speed limits on roads, for instance, in street. We have to sort of make some kind of quotation about international flying and so on the short term. I think we have to do these kind of radical things.
Yes.
Well, as you say, a lot of this comes down to travel and transport. And I think that is actually, to me, that's probably right, because we can deal with most of the other emissions, particularly in somewhere like Sweden. In fact, probably similar for Norway. We can deal with most of the other emissions, a high proportion of them, from sort of static use of energy in our homes and electricity. There are plenty of things you can do here. Already the electricity is low carbon in Sweden, and obviously very low carbon in Norway. The problem is the transport sector. And I think there it comes down to we have to do things slower, as Isak said, and we have to do less of them. And so I think those two, there's no neat way out of that. And aviation, I mean, even with cars, you can't swap every internal combustion car for an electric vehicle. You still end up with big traffic jams. You still end up with huge material use, in fact, more material use. An internal combustion engine car that weighs 1.25 tons will weigh almost 2 tons if it's an EV, electric car. So it will take a lot more energy to make that car. And so we can't just swap that out. So even on the road transport, we have to do things differently. When it comes to flying, that's absolutely the case because there are no technologies in the near term here to do anything significant. But the great thing about flying, and I guess it's the same for Sweden as the UK, 75% of all flights in the UK are taken by 15% of the population. In any one year, half the UK population doesn't fly. So flying is a preserve of a very small part of our society. They're the ones, the frequent flyers. It's not the people that fly occasionally. It's the frequent flyers. So in fact, demand management, containing how often we fly, is not much of an issue for most people because they don't fly very often. Even in countries that fly a lot, like Sweden and the UK and Norway. So the transport sector, to me, is the area we really have to address. And I'll just use up the phrase that George Monbiot has used, is private sufficiency and public luxury. And I think that captures it quite well. As private citizens, we should be talking about sufficiency, not efficiency, but sufficiency. What's sufficient for us to live good private lives? But then public luxury could be things like parks and swimming pools and all the other things that make civil society, civic life really worth having. And we can all share those things rather than us all owning them privately. So I think that's a really interesting concept, that private sufficiency and public luxury.
We need to sum up and go into our longer break with a fika, but I would like to thank you so much for commenting on this. Thank you all for participating. And would you have some closing remarks on how this work will progress?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Kevin and Isak. It has been very, very helpful. I will bring with me this about how to address the biosector, that we maybe shall pay more attention to this about ecological jag hittar inte ordet, sorry. Mångfald. Just biodiversity and so on, more than maybe calculating carbon dioxide. So that I think we shall look more into.
Okay.
And also this final remark about transportation, that's one of our focus areas. So we work on that. Thank you.
Thank you.